We're exactly 1 week away from NFL football again, guys, and I cannot tell you enough how excited I am about fantasy football starting back up in literally just 1 week away. There is nothing that makes me happier than watching NFL football and playing fantasy football and talking about it with you guys as a community. Now, a lot of you have already drafted your particular fantasy football teams, and what this means is that we're in prime time of upgrading your current teams at this particular moment before anything else has happened. So we need to go through 5 wide receivers that you need to sell high before week 1 fantasy football. So we're going to start out here with Mr. Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams here. So here's the deal with Cooper Kupp. This one needs to be very, very specific. We are talking about a guy that you are drafting in the beginning of the first round of your drafts. You cannot just settle for anybody when you are looking to trade Cooper Kupp high. But first of all, let me explain why Cooper Kupp is on this list. As high as he is going, it may confuse some people on why I have him on this particular list. I think the Rams are going to be awful this year. I think they're going to be absolutely terrible. And here's the thing that I've gotten a lot of flack for specifically over the past couple of days. When I did my wide receivers rankings video just a couple of days ago, I mentioned that I believe that Matt Stafford is actually worse of a quarterback right now than Tua Tagovailoa is in Miami. I believe that Stafford is massively declining right now. And you know what? I think the Rams know it too, because if you look back to the offseason, the Rams not only tried to get Matt Stafford to take a pay cut, but they also tried to trade him during the offseason. Here's the reality of that as well. No team wanted to trade for him, and the reason is because his contract is massive and he's not worth the contract anymore. Nobody's debating the legacy of Matt Stafford, but at this current moment in time, he is absolutely declining, and the Rams know it. And the reality is with Cooper Kupp specifically, is that Cooper Kupp is also dealing with an injury himself right now. Now, I know that he has said that he expects to be ready to play it in week 1, and the Rams, by all accounts, look like they expect him to be ready for week 1 as well. But since Cooper Kupp is coming into the season coming off of an injury, and he is now 30 years old, there are serious concerns I have with Cooper Kupp as a player. But above Cooper Kupp's concerns, really, I have the most issues with the Rams as a team as far as providing serious fantasy football value. With that said, if there's one Ram I want, it's Cooper Kupp. Because when you look at what he did last year, he was incredible. In the 9 games that he played, he averaged over 10 targets a game, almost 11 targets a game, over 18 fantasy points per game in half PPR. He was crazy good and crazy important to this team. The reality is that Cooper Kupp is absolutely going to dominate in not only targets in this offense, but also in production. He's their best player on offense, their best playmaker by a country mile. It is not close, so he is going to give you the most value. But the reason I think you should trade high on him is because I simply don't think, with what I discussed with Matt Stafford and the concerns with Cooper Kupp, that his ceiling is as high as it has been over the past 2 years. But like I said, you cannot just sell Cooper Kupp for nothing. He's going too early and has too high of a ceiling for that type of behavior. What you need to do is, I would personally target a guy like A.J. Brown, Stephon Diggs, or Garrett Wilson with a low-end running back 1 or a high-end running back 2 attached to the deal, because the reality is those guys are viewed as a tier or 2 below Cooper Kupp in 2023 fantasy football. So you could take advantage of getting a guy who is going to be a little bit safer and has almost just as high of a ceiling as a guy like Cooper Kupp. Now, moving on to number 2, I've got DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks on this list. Now, here's the thing about DK. I was actually originally planning to put him on this list after week 1. And the reason I say that is because I figured that with the Jackson Smith-Njigba wrist surgery that he just had literally a couple of days ago, I was like, there's no way that Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to play. And I think DK Metcalf will have a lot of value and will come out swinging very early on without Jackson Smith-Njigba there. Here's the reality, though. We have news that Jackson Smith-Njigba is already practicing fully again after a couple of days after his wrist surgery. And here's the thing, Jackson Smith-Njigba has a bulky cast on his wrist right now, but when you watched him in practice, it didn't look like he was limited at all. He was still running full speed, catching the ball perfectly. Jackson Smith-Njigba may be ready for week 1, And we may not make it to week 1 for DK to show you a massive amount of value. But the silver lining here for DK Metcalf is that he has tremendous value right now. Tremendous perceived value before the actual season starts. That is the reality here with DK Metcalf. He is viewed as the wide receiver 1 on this offense and as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. And a lot of people are just less worried with this Jackson Smith-Njigba injury. A lot of people think with the Smith-Njigba injury, DK Metcalf is going to be even better than he already would have been. But I want to look a little bit closer at DK Metcalf, specifically from a fantasy football lens. When you look at DK Metcalf last year in particular, he averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game, and he was the wide receiver 18 finish. Now, I got a comment a couple of days ago on a video that I did on the wide receiver rankings video about how stupid I was for ranking DK Metcalf below a lot of wide receiver 2s on their respective teams. But let's look at this right here. 5 wide receiver 2s on their respective teams finished above DK Metcalf in 2022. T. Higgins, Brandon Ayuk, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, and also the wide receiver 2 on his own team, Tyler Lockett, finished above DK Metcalf. And here's the other thing. DK Metcalf had more targets than all of those guys. All of them. He out-targeted every single one of those guys. So that shows you that not only does he not have the great quarterback that a lot of those other guys have, but he's also in a situation, he's just not as efficient with the work that he gets as those other guys. I have been on record this offseason saying Jackson Smith-Njigba will be a better fantasy football wide receiver than DK Metcalf right out of the gate this year. I have been on record saying that, and a lot of people have called me crazy for calling that. But really, when you look at it from that perspective on fantasy football and all the wide receiver 2s finishing above him and its fantasy points per game, it's really not that crazy to think that Jackson Smith-Njigba will be better than DK Metcalf right out of the gate. But his perceived value is higher than his real value is. And this is a perfect opportunity to easily upgrade. At the running back position in particular, a guy like DK Metcalf could pair very well with Aaron Jones in a trade for a guy like Christian Kirk and Josh Jacobs. Because the reality here, like I said, is that DK Metcalf, his value is very, very high. And Christian Kirk, a guy who I actually think is going to finish higher than DK Metcalf this year, is not nearly in the same class of value as far as perception goes at this time of the season. I really like selling DK right now. I just don't think that he's going to provide you the value that will match what his value is right now before the season actually starts. Now, moving on to our number 3 guy on the list, I've got Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens on this list. Now, here's the thing about this. This may not sound like a sell high at all. I mean, Zay Flowers is going in the back half of drafts right now, and he's basically going in the wide receiver 40-ish range, depending on the platform that you're drafting on. So what we need to remember with sell high players and specifically is sell high depends on current and future value, regardless of where you're drafted. A guy like Zay Flowers, if he's being drafted as a wide receiver 40, well, if he finishes as the wide receiver 50, that is going to be a sell high if you sold him earlier before his value started dropping in accordance with how he was actually performing in fantasy football. So it's all very subjective and it's all very dependent on the current value that a player holds and the future value that they will hold. So the simple answer to this on why I think this is a sell high moment for Zay Flowers is I don't believe that he's going to return the investment value that you're putting in on him, and that is saying quite a lot considering how late he's going. So here's the deal with the Ravens, right? The Ravens all offseason, we've seen reports that this offense is going to really let it rip and light it up through the air this season. That's all the reports that we've seen out of Baltimore this offseason. So for 1 second, let's just act like that's a true statement and they are going to let Lamar Jackson rip. Let's just act like it's true for 1 second. Here's the reality. Lamar Jackson still prefers to throw to Mark Andrews. This is his preferred target, and I can tell you that for a fact because Mark Andrews has led this team in targets in 3 of the past 4 seasons in Baltimore. That absolutely needs to be addressed because here's the thing. This is a very similar offense to Kansas City in a way, and let me tell you the way it is similar. So when you look at the target leaders over the years for Kansas City, the only guy that led in targets besides Travis Kelce is Tyreek Hill. And Tyreek Hill only led the team in targets 1 out of his last 4 seasons in Kansas City. So both of these teams, their best wide receiver target is their tight end, and Zay Flowers is not Tyreek Hill. Let me tell you that right off the bat. Some people may argue that he is better than Marquise Hollywood Brown is, and I don't blame you for thinking that. But the reality is, Mark Andrews is Lamar Jackson's primary target in this offense. And the second part of this, which leads me into the other problem I have, let's stop pretending for a second that this team is going to be effective letting the ball rip. This is not going to be a reality for them. Here's Lamar Jackson's reality, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, and I will probably hear about it in the comments, but we need to address reality here with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson has thrown for over 400 pass attempts one time in his career and has thrown for over 3,000 yards only one time in his career. 3,000 yards in this modern day NFL where everybody is throwing for 4,000 yards or more is such a low bar. And throwing for 400 pass attempts is also a super low bar as well when you've got quarterbacks throwing for over 600 passes in this league now. So the reality with this situation is a lot of people are going to look at this and say, well, when you look at the situation with the Baltimore Ravens, maybe this was a Greg Roman problem and he just didn't want to let him rip. Well, let's say that that's the case. It wouldn't be the case if Lamar Jackson was this top tier thrower. If he was a guy like Justin Herbert, Josh Allen, he wouldn't have to deal with these problems of being held back as far as his passing attempts go per year because he's not that talented. And those other guys had offensive coordinator concerns at one point in their careers or are currently dealing with them. So the reality here is that Lamar Jackson, if he was a better thrower, he would have been throwing more throughout his entire career. I think it's best to sell the dream on a guy like Zay Flowers. You know what it is to sell the dream to somebody, right? You go in there and you pitch them the perfect scenario, the dream scenario of a guy who may work out. This is what I think you should do with Zay Flowers. He's a rookie. He's an exciting guy. He's on an electric offense. This is going to be the best type of deal to package Zay Jones to upgrade yourself and got a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba, a fellow rookie wide receiver, or a running back like Khalil Herbert. Because the reality is, I just do not believe that Zay Flowers is going to return your investment value. Now, moving on to number 4 on the list, I've got Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Listen, I've been beating the drum on Calvin Ridley all offseason long, and why I just believe he's just simply overvalued this offseason. You're talking about getting a guy in the back of the second round and sometimes the third round of drafts. That is just simply crazy to me. And let me tell you this. I understand the hype. I really do. Because when you look back to 2020, the hype was absolutely worth it. I mean, he was the wide receiver for that year, over 15 fantasy points per game, all of those 16 fantasy points per game. So he was a very good player. But the reality is, guys, that was 3 years ago now. 3 seasons ago is when he did that. And it's not like a Walt Disney situation where they just put him in a freezer and he doesn't age. That's not the case here. Calvin Ridley's 28 years old. He didn't just de-age or not age at all over these past couple of seasons. And the reality is, recent history of players who sat out for at least a year or more, when they come out of missing a full season or more, their first year is not good, either from a result of bad play or being injury prone because their bodies are not adjusted to playing football again. You don't just walk right back out onto a football field and are dominant immediately. I'm not saying he can't do that, and there's no way, but history has shown us recently with guys like Michael Thomas, Le'Veon Bell, Deshaun Watson last year, that this is extremely unlikely for a player like this. And also, the other reality with this particular situation in Jacksonville is that the reason I understand is also because Jacksonville's offense is going to be tremendous this year. They are going to take a leap this year. Trevor Lawrence, second year with Doug Peterson. Weapons are good. This offense is going to be electric for sure. But here's the other thing. Christian Kirk, also on this team, was the wide receiver 11 last year in half PPR, and he's on a 4-year, $72 million contract with $37 million guaranteed. So it's not like this offense is just going to phase him out entirely because they've got Calvin Ridley now. That's not going to happen in this situation. Christian Kirk is going to be very involved in this offense. Calvin Ridley is not going to be the wide receiver 1 by a wide margin, if he even is at all. But the beauty about Calvin Ridley, like I said, is that he is being overvalued right now. You can get a great return if you go out and you seek a Calvin Ridley truther. This is the type of guy you want to go after. Someone who was really mad that you drafted him in the first place and they want a piece of him. I would package him together with another guy to upgrade at wide receiver or upgrade at running back. A deal like Calvin Ridley and Dalvin Cook for Josh Jacobs and Drake London, that's a fantastic deal to me. Now moving on to number 5 on the list, I've got Monroe St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. This one, much like the Cooper Kupp one, has to be very, very specific as well. Because here's the thing, I love Monroe St. Brown. I think he's a tremendous player, and I think he's going to be great in fantasy football again. When you look at what he did last year, almost averaged 10 targets a game, averaged 13.4 fantasy points per game, wide receiver 8 finish. He was very good in fantasy football. But the reality is, this year, he's going off the board in round 2 on platforms like ESPN or Sleeper. Last year, you didn't have to draft him until like the 4th or 5th, sometimes 6th round in drafts. So the value here is just simply not going to be as great because he's going according to his value. So here's the thing about Monroe St. Brown. When you look at the guys, some guys going in front of him on different platforms, you can see guys like CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, all of those guys are going in front of them. All of those guys averaged over 14 fantasy points per game in 2022, while Monroe averaged only 13 fantasy points per game. So he's not in the same class as those guys because he doesn't have the ceiling of those types of guys. Now, what I will say, obviously nobody's going to dispute this, he's the clear wide receiver 1 in this Detroit Lions offense. There's no question about it. Jameson Williams, 6-game suspension. He's probably not going to be much of a factor until maybe later in the year as well. So from a wide receiver perspective on his particular team, it's going to be a very similar situation. But I would argue that this situation might actually be a little bit worse for Monroe St. Brown than it was last year due to Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is going to take targets away from somebody. I don't know if it's going to be Monroe St. Brown, but Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get his in the passing game as well. So when I'm looking at a guy like Devontae Adams, this is the perfect guy for me to target because he simply doesn't have the ceiling of a guy like Devontae Adams, and Devontae Adams has his own question marks as well. So to me, you can sell the ideal situation of Monroe St. Brown's perfect situation in Detroit, improving offense, clear wide receiver 1, to a guy who may be uncertain about Devontae Adams' quarterback situation and with his age factor as well. But remember that Devontae Adams simply does have a higher ceiling than Monroe St. Brown. So the short answer here is do not settle on Monroe St. Brown. If you sell Monroe St. Brown, you have to sell the upgrade. So let me know what you think of these guys in the comments and if you are actively trying to buy or sell these guys. And if you want to see the top 30 running backs for fantasy football in 2023, click on this video right here.